If you follow Elon Musk on X, you will see that he is constantly posting and panicking about the so-called fertility crisis and population crisis, and how it will somehow lead to the end of humanity. Now, this is ironic because, as you will see in this video, he has the single most influence on the increase or decrease in the population as the richest man in the world. He may even be the driving force behind this change through the invention of the Tesla Optimus robot and several other innovations. So, today's video is not going to be the mainstream confusion about what is causing population changes. I'm going to be explaining the true underlying economic forces that control the size of the population and the dystopian future that we may be looking at. Now, when you look on the internet for the causes of fertility declines, everyone has their personal theory and pet issue for what is causing the decline in their own country. Some people blame things like pornography, feminism, central banking, and of course politics. But these are just reactions to the same underlying economic cause. When it comes to solving this so-called crisis, the proposals again focus on the symptoms and completely ignore how population size is actually determined. But all of these people are wrong. There is no solution, and the cause is simply the economic force of our most wealthy class of people, the billionaire property owners. Now, before we talk about what is happening today, I want to give you some background about population from my favorite book called Essay on Economic Theory. This is one of the earliest economics books ever written, and Cantillon, who was a French banker from the 18th century, has tons of great truthful takes that people would probably not publish today due to political correctness. His most controversial and brilliant insights came in chapters 12 and 15, where he explained that the masses live at the expense of the property owners, and therefore the size of the population is going to depend on the goods and services demanded by the property-owning class. This has been largely forgotten in today's society, but you'll see that it is completely true. First, let's explain why everyone is dependent on the expense of property owners for their survival. In chapter 12, he states, "There are none but the prince and the property owners who live independent. If the prince and property owners close their estates and will not allow them to be cultivated, it is clear that there will neither be food nor clothing for any of the inhabitants of the state. Consequently, all the individuals of the state are supported, not only by the product of the land that is cultivated for the benefit of the owners, but also at the expense of these same owners, from whose property they derive all that they have. Everything in a state depends mainly on the moods, modes, and ways of life of the property owners. Today, for a worker who owns no property, which represents most young people today, they are reliant on the expenses of the owners of the company for all their basic needs. If you are not making a profit for the owner, then they can lay you off and you won't be able to afford anything." Now, the economy today is much more complicated, so many people forget how this system actually works. But Cantillon addresses this as well. Need and necessity enable all who work or are employed in the state to exist. All these working people serve not only the prince and the property owners, but each other as well. Many of them do not work directly for the property owners, and so it is not seen that they subsist on the capital of these proprietors and live at their expense. So whether you realize it or not, if you don't own any property, the economic reason for your existence is to serve a want or need of a property owner. You can therefore also never gain your own property unless it is at the expense of a property owner and taken from a property owner. Now, you're probably thinking, that seems really unfair. Didn't we get rid of the feudal system a long time ago? Well, life's not fair. And if you don't believe me, take a look at this chart. These people on the bottom, the 90%, exist at the expense of these people at the top. Now, if you are in the bottom 50%, it's true that you can move classes, but you can only do it by paying your labor tax to the upper 10%. And of course, if you don't live in the US and you also don't own property, then your situation is even worse. As further proof of this, just consider how Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos earned all of their wealth. They created their businesses by selling most of them to the existing property owners. Then they used that capital to generate an enormous return, mostly going to the existing property owners. Likewise, every employee in their corporation is housed and fed because they are providing value to the shareholders, or the property owners of a business. These two men and all of their employees only grew rich at the expense of existing property owners. Now we move on to how population size is also determined by the property owners. This is where Cantillon drops his most powerful revelations in chapter 15. He says, quote, "If the property owners had the desire to increase the population, they would encourage peasants to marry young and raise children by promising to provide them with subsistence, devoting the land entirely to that purpose, and they would doubtless increase the population. But if instead the prince or the property owners made them use the land for other purposes than the upkeep of the people, if, by the prices they offer in the market for commodities and merchandise, they determine that the farmers will employ the land for other purposes than the maintenance of men. As a modern example here, consider healthcare for the elderly, which is demanded by the government and property owners, who are the ones who pay for it. It's highly incentivized in the market by strong wages for doctors and nurses. Now, on the other side of the issue, encouraging population growth through childcare, which is demanded by the property poor Gen Z and millennial classes, is a minimum wage position. So you can see how the market forces work, and there are examples of this throughout the economy. He makes his point with an example from his own time, saying, quote, "If the ladies of Paris enjoy wearing Brussels lace, and if France pays for this lace with champagne wine, the production of a single acre of flax must be paid for with the production of 16,000 acres of vineyards. Suffice it to say that in this transaction, a great amount of the production of the land is withdrawn from the subsistence of the French." The perfect modern analog here is some of the luxury spending of Jeff Bezos. Through his purchasing power, he can influence the market and drive changes to the population. If he so desired, he could spend all of his capital to concentrate labor on building affordable housing and providing food to the population. This would undoubtedly increase the population, as we'll be discussing next. Instead, if he spends his capital on building a mega yacht, the labor which could have increased the population is instead spent on his own luxury. Most property owners like to do a little of both, and since they control nearly all the capital, they will control the growth or decline in population. Elon Musk, despite his complaints about the shrinking population, focuses his capital on his goals of space exploration and technology, choosing to spend very little on efforts to increase the size of the population. Now we get to the economic fact that more abundant housing and subsistence will lead to population growth. Here Cantillon says, "When I said that the property owners might multiply the population as far as the land would support them, I assumed that most men desire nothing better than to marry if they are set in a position to maintain their families in the same style as they are content to live themselves. Only a few men in a state avoid marriage because of a pure libertine spirit. All the lower classes wish to live and raise children who can live at least like themselves. When laborers and artisans do not marry, it is because they wait until they save enough to enable them to set up a household or to find some young woman who brings a little capital for that purpose. Every day they see others like themselves who, for lack of such precautions, start a family and fall into the most frightful poverty, being obliged to deprive themselves of their own food in order to nourish their children." So for some Gen Z and millennial women today who aren't born into wealth, they sort of often complain about men who aren't able to commit or don't want to commit. And there's actually an economic force behind this. So if they were born with a giant inheritance, the story would probably look a little bit different. And for a lot of men these days, they can't afford to start a family with their standard of living. So they are choosing to remain what Cantillon would call a bachelor, or in other words, not starting a family. They also see that men who end up laid off or divorced often live in squalor when they have to support their family, and especially when they have a lot of kids. On top of this, we also have the mounting student loan situation, in which the liabilities are put on the young people, and then the assets go to the property-owning older class. Now again, this is the economic force that's causing a lot of these social problems, which are often blamed, and is often what people say, but these are just symptoms that people then think are the root cause of fertility decline. So moving on, Cantillon says, "The increase of population can be carried furthest in the countries where the people are content to live the most poorly and to consume the least production of the soil. In countries where all the peasants and laborers are accustomed to eat meat and drink wine, beer, etc., not many inhabitants can be supported." So I can't help but think of modern-day South Korea when I see this statement. So if you've seen vlogs of Korea or seen Korean movies on Netflix, you'll see that they have a tremendous separation between the rich and the poor. So housing is very expensive, and the property-owning rich people in Korea love to buy luxury goods. And they have a pretty extravagant diet. If you see how people live there, even the poorest class eat tons of meat and beer, etc. Now, if we look at the fertility rate in Korea, it is 0.78 births per woman. So this is almost the lowest of anywhere in the world. And this is notable because many years ago, there was a massive increase in population when the country industrialized and the productivity and incoming resources expanded. Now, there are other industrial countries with much, much cheaper labor So the demand for labor in Korea by the property owners has decreased. So the young men in Korea today know that they cannot support a large family at their standard of living. They need to live in poverty to be able to support a large family. So for this reason, they're in no hurry to marry, and you see the fertility rates go down. Now let's contrast this with Nigeria, where the people are content to eat much simpler diets and live in slums throughout the country. They also have a massive influx of resources and money in the form of oil. So the labor is highly desired by the property owners around the world. And this makes the population grow very quickly. So Nigeria's standard of living will increase naturally over time. And eventually the property owners in Nigeria will start to demand luxury foreign goods instead of an increased population like they did in Korea. Okay, so moving on, he says here, men multiply like mice in a barn if they have unlimited means of subsistence. The English in the colonies will become more numerous in proportion in 3 generations than they would in 30 in England, because in the colonies they cultivate new tracts of land from which they expel the savages. Now this reminded me of the tragic situation in Afghanistan in 2021. The country initially has very little natural resources to support a large population. So when the US invaded in 2001, they began supporting the population with massive amounts of import and foreign aid. So, as you can see on this chart, the population doubled in a single generation over the 20-year war, enabled by the virtually unlimited amounts of money and imports flooding into the country. The US had spent well over $100 billion on direct aid over the 20-year war, accounting for about a third of the GDP. When the US took away this proverbial cheese by removing aid and freezing the assets of the old government, there was mass starvation and sickness across the country, well documented by this Vice documentary. So you can see here, the property owners in the US, or actually the government of the US, stopped demanding the labor of the Afghan citizens. So because of the lagging effects of fertility, the population will continue to increase for some time, and the standard of living will also continue to decline. At the end of the chapter, Cantillon drops probably my favorite line of the entire book. He says, "It is also a question, outside of my subject, whether it is better to have a great multitude of inhabitants, poor and badly provided for, or a smaller number with better means. A million who consume the product of 6 acres per head, or 4 million who live on the product of 1.5 acres. So I think this sentence really sums up the question that the market poses and that the property owners are answering. I completely agree with the sentiment, which is why I'd agree with the kind of raging panic on both sides of this issue. So, to summarize this theory, population size is determined by the wants and needs of the property owners. When the rich demand certain goods and services, increasing or decreasing the labor devoted to maintain the population, the birth rates will increase or decline. This is actually what Cantillon claims started the French Revolution. Now here you're probably asking, isn't the government a massive property owner? Shouldn't they be able to control the size of the population? Well, this is true, and the prince of Cantillon's day is now replaced by our new forms of government. But the government, in most cases, is a republic, which is primarily controlled by voters, donors, and legislators who are property-owning baby boomers. As a result, the working Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z are taxed, and the vast majority of the government budget is spent on Medicare for boomers' healthcare and Social Security for boomer gambling money. In fact, all classes of elderly people receive free Medicare, and Social Security is actually a regressive system, where the richest boomers will receive 3 times as much from Social Security as the lowest class boomers. So the government system mostly benefits the wealthy property owners through this primary incentive. And these effects are not just a property of capitalism. Socialism has the same effects, but the state is the only property owner, so its demands will determine the size of the population, and it kind of just looks a little bit different. In communist China, for example, the Great Leap Forward was a massive demand by the state to have the people focus on industrializing and making steel instead of focusing on farming. This quickly slowed the population growth, noticeably when they had the most massive famine in history, and farming had been scaled back. The population quickly recovered, though, and eventually the state wanted to focus on industry so much that they created the one-child policy. And today, the birth rate is down to 1.18. So with the power in communist countries, they do have both market and non-market related things, so their effect on population is actually stronger than in capitalism. One more thing to mention is that even though the long-term population number is dependent on the nature of the property owner's expenses, the effects have massive lags, and we can see this in population pyramids. So like in any other market, there will be lags, positive feedback loops, and negative feedback loops. The obvious positive feedback loop that everyone talks about is caused by the lifespan of humans lasting 3 or 4 generations. If the population birth rate increases in generation 1, there will be more reproductive age women for the next generation. Likewise, if the birth rate declines, there will be fewer mothers for the next generation. There is an even stronger negative feedback loop, however, and this is that once a population starts to actually decline, the resources in capital and land per person start to increase, and this will cause the fertility to go back up. After the Black Death, which was basically a Thanos snap that killed half the population, the land per person doubled and the capital per person doubled, and the fertility rates moved up significantly in the next 200 years, and the population quickly recovered. A collapse we could see today could actually be as strong as the plague in terms of population decline due to the upside-down pyramid, but the market has plenty of time to react, and at some point the people would grow so wealthy that they would start breeding like rabbits. Another claim of Elon Musk's is that the population will lead to the end of humanity, and I think I've made it clear that this doesn't make sense. We also have actual infinite resources in the galaxy and the universe, so in the very long term, it's just like every other species. We're not just all going to randomly die off from the population getting too big. There's also the constant effect of technology, by which capital increases the productivity of land and labor. This is why we saw an exponential explosion in population for thousands of years straight with almost no sign of stopping. It also means that the burden of all those old people on the population period will be sort of insignificant with the high technology we're developing. Okay, now that we have all the theory down, it's time to talk about the situation that we find ourselves in today. So the specific country fertility rates are all different, and I don't want to make this video 5 hours long, so I'm not going to discuss these case by case. Just to summarize my opinion, I think it is just the market demands of the property owners finding the cheapest labor and resources and encouraging fertility in those locations by sending capital in exchange for labor. Countries where labor got too expensive or natural resources run out have less global demand, and the pressure on fertility goes negative. The pressure, I think, also acts most obviously through the housing market. Now, I started writing a whole section about the US and our population situation, but I decided to cut it for time. And I think we can discuss more specific countries in the comments if you'd like. The trend I want to talk about is that we are starting to see a neutral or even negative pressure on global population for the first time in history. This, like all other population changes, is caused by the demands of the property owners. So the question is really, how are those demands changing? Well, property owners always want more profits, and so the ultimate demands they always have had are better technology, more automation, and in the past, more labor. When jobs have been automated through history, people have never failed to find new jobs. This has never shrunk the population in the past, so how is it going to be different this time? Well, for the first time in history, automation of all jobs will be possible, and jobs will be fully automated. So labor has always become worth less versus capital and land over the course of capitalism, but pretty soon it'll become pretty worthless. The best example of this is technology companies, especially Twitter, when Elon Musk became the property owner. He took a look at the company and literally decided that he only demanded 20% of the labor that they were using to run the company. Despite laying off almost the entire workforce, he kept almost all of the land and capital, and the app worked perfectly fine. They actually started making changes and improvements much faster, and the company finally turned a profit despite never making money in its entire existence. After this, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon almost immediately all started firing their bottom 20% of their laborers. Now, Elon, because of his wealth and influence, now controls one of the most powerful groups in the new government, the Department of Government Efficiency. Here, he's running the same game plan and wants to fire the millions of bureaucrats who lose money for the government and property owners who are taxed. Both parties are actually supporting him on this because he is saving them money and not touching the two programs which benefit property owners, which is Social Security and Medicare. Now we get to Elon's Tesla Optimus robot, which, if you think about it, is explicitly designed to replace human labor. Here are some quotes that Elon has about Optimus. So in the first one, he says this: "If you think about the economy, the foundation of the economy is labor. Capital equipment is distilled labor. So what happens if you don't actually have a labor shortage? I'm not sure what an economy even means at that point. That is what Optimus is about." So here he's making a really profound point, and it's sort of the same thing I was saying. He means that productivity will go to infinity, or in other words, the amount of value generated per worker will go to infinity because you won't need any workers. And you can generate wealth with no labor. This actually solves the sort of communistic complaint that Karl Marx had, where he said, it's unfair that there's a lower oppressed class who needs to work for the property owners. But of course, this also means that the only remaining class will be the property owners because they won't demand any labor. Now, here he says, I wouldn't worry about putting people out of a job thing. I think we're actually going to have, and already do have, a massive shortage of labor. So I think we'll have not people out of work, but actually still a shortage of labor in the future. So here I think he's making a good point, but he's also contradicting his last statement. So in the first comment he said there would be no labor shortage, and in this one he says there will be. I think he's basically just meaning that in the short term there will be a labor shortage. So as I'll explain later, you'll still be able to find a job, but you'll be paid much less. And either way, your labor is going to be worth much less to him and everyone else. You will still have a job for some time, but your wages will asymptotically approach zero. Okay, and the last statement here he says, I want Optimus to eventually lead us into a future of abundance, a future where there's no poverty and you can have whatever you want in terms of products and services. Now here, by you, he means property owners who can afford an Optimus robot. He's not going to give these things away for free, and him and the other Tesla shareholders are going to be far separated from the poor, and they're going to demand a profit for these things. So it's really only the property owners who are going to have access to Tesla Optimus robots. So look, if you don't own any property in the form of land or stocks or anything like this should really alarm you. And you should really try your best to either get some property, or if you're sort of socialist minded, find a political solution that would put you into the highest class. I don't think a socialistic or communistic revolution is the most likely scenario, but it is entirely possible. For myself, I plan on trying to own a lot of property over time, and that is sort of my individual solution. If there is a successful socialist revolution, then I would probably need to try to pivot and try to join the leading party, who would basically be the new property owners. So moving on, this goes much further beyond physical labor, and pretty much every job is going to be automated. This year, Mark Zuckerberg said he announced that he wants to create fully functioning computer programming agents by the end of 2025. Sam Altman and Satya Nadella basically totally agree with this, and OpenAI's new series of models are now smarter than most PhDs in their own fields. I already consider O3 as smarter than myself, and it's really only going to get better from here. So look guys, knowledge workers will basically not be needed anymore, and really in the medium term. And so unless you're kind of a cracked PhD level engineer who's working on these AI solutions, your labor is not going to be needed 100 years from now. Now, the most common misunderstanding here is that people think this will take all jobs immediately. No. You will easily be able to find a job, but it will just pay less. It's a market. So when you get laid off due to automation, you find a new job at a lower wage because your skills are not demanded by any property owners. You either have to spend time or money to learn new skills or take a low-skill job and basically make minimum wage. Now, if the market price of labor actually gets down to the price floor that's set by the government, which would be the minimum wage, this is when you would start to see mass unemployment. But it's probably not likely. They would probably just change the minimum wage at that point. So relative prices in the labor market have been decreasing for a long time, and they will continue to do so. On the other side of the market, capital and land will become even more productive and profitable since they require less labor and expenses due to technology. So to summarize, the ratio of wages to capital and land, or asset prices, will decrease and go to zero as productivity goes to infinity. And here lies the economic force that will be affecting population in the long run. As asset prices go up, it takes the lower class longer and longer to save up to buy property, and family formation slows. In economics, there's always been the ideas of land, labor, and capital, which needed to be somewhat balanced for the property owner to get their goods and services. Now with AGI, robots, and self-driving vehicles, property owners can fulfill all of their desires with only capital, just like Elon Musk said. Everyone lives at the expense of the property owner, and they will not need you. This is what Elon Musk says when he says, it is not clear what money will even mean. Money is mostly a tool to direct labor and trade land and capital. So in the future, money will mean the same thing, but won't need to control any labor because labor is worthless. Money will basically just be a tool for property owners to trade property and capital with each other. If you still don't believe me, consider this example. Throughout history, landowners will use the land for whatever they desire. The population would be determined by how many people are needed to do the jobs. Up until now, landowners set aside land for food for their workers, which they needed. In the future, workers will have no economic value, so you can use the farms for something like biofuel, or you can just put solar panels over all the farms to power your robots. And this is the self-interested, rational decision for the property owners. So in my opinion, Elon is actually right that we will see a population collapse, but it won't be the end of humanity. And it will actually be in part directly caused by his economic decisions. Also, the collapse will only happen if the property owners follow their rational self-interest. If they want to have a 90% class that exists below them, then they can support this with their robots and immense wealth. I think in the very long term, this class will disappear, but I really have no idea. That's just speculation. You could have a situation like Bill Gates, who uses all of his capital to support the population in places like Africa. And again, I can also frame this as a good thing, because the lower classes are oppressed for the luxury of the upper class under capitalism. This isn't a criticism of capitalism, this is just sort of a fact, and I don't know if it's really good or bad. From the perspective of the property owners, it's actually very good. So, in my opinion, this lower oppressed class is going to go away one way or the other. Now, I don't think this is an evil plan of Elon's. In fact, based on his posts, I don't think he really thinks about the population situation as the same way that I do. Now, I'm not going to claim that I am smarter than Elon Musk when it comes to economics, especially when he has an economics degree and I don't. But I will say that based on all of his other posts about economic issues, I don't think he's capable of crafting some elaborate economic plan that's kind of a secret evil plan. But again, I'm also a big fan of Elon Musk and his companies as the CEO, so I'm also very biased. But for Elon, I think it's really time to put up or shut up when it comes to this issue. So Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, they're giving all their money away when they die, and so this is likely increasing the population in the lower classes. So maybe Elon should donate all of his companies to a baby-making foundation when he dies. Otherwise, I think it's time for him to stop spazzing out about population when he has so much power over it. It kind of just annoys me at this point. Now, before this actually comes to pass, the separation of the rich and the poor will already become so great that we'll probably have some sort of class struggles, and I think it could get a little bit ugly. Or on the other side, maybe it'll be a great utopia where everyone can become somewhat of a property owner peacefully. We'll just have to see. Now, some people watching this will kind of jump to the conclusion and say, this is bad, I can't afford a family because I'm in the lower class. Well, I don't view it as good as bad, and I don't really view it in that way. So it's just the way the economics have worked through human history. You could get your babies, you just need to be aware of the economic situation you are in, and maybe lower your standard of living, or maybe work more hours, or something like this. So in my opinion, there's really no solution to this natural economic force, but there is a solution at the individual level. So the solution is you can just serve the property owners and work much harder, spend less on your own maintenance and especially on your own luxury, and then become a property owner yourself and move classes. As a property owner, you can have as many kids as you want. So basically that's my plan as far as my financial life goes. Okay, now this is really supposed to be a space channel, so I probably won't make many more videos on this, but I really just wanted to put that out there because I think a lot of people are really confused about population and they sort of blame it on all these other symptoms, and it's sort of just getting ridiculous. So with that being said, please like, subscribe, comment, and of course watch all my other videos. And with that being said, have a great day.